and that they are numerous and haven't found a naming of themselves in our scholarship. And I think these perspectives are allowing us to see that there is so much that isn't captured by being South African or being Indian or being any of these things, but in motion and mobile. And in some ways, the only word I can find for it is slightly askance from what the category has imagined you have to be. And I see that mobility. For me, that is very exciting and sets a research agenda for, I imagine, decades.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I think also what this book tries to do is to make the argument that it's no longer possible really to look at one diaspora in isolation, and that we have to think about cross-cutting diasporas, and so that would mean and cross-cutting diasporas in relation to the societies through which they flow. Because previously, to look at one diaspora, and there's huge amount of work, for example, on the South Asian diaspora or the Chinese diaspora, is actually to reproduce the categories of empire. So it's part of a much bigger kind of intellectual trend, which is trying to say we have to look at those cross-cutting diasporas. And I think the really important thing here is to think about how they do and don't intersect with African society, and that you have to have a lens that grasps all of those at the same time.
Hi, sorry. I was just wondering, I haven't read your book, so I don't know what sort of time frame you're looking at, but I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the emergent South-South groupings that are sort of cropping up here and there, like the basic countries, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and therefore two of your countries, and the BRICS sort of grouping, and yeah, just do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, none of the chapters in the book actually cover that, but we kind of addressed it a little bit in the introduction, where we talk about, we conclude with the idea of the global South and rethinking the global South, and that's what Isabella was talking about, that the old third worldist discourses of the past are no longer, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 1990s, there's a whole new rethinking of the global order. And I think in the post-American domination, post-US domination, these southern alliances are becoming much more prominent. So we conclude with thinking about a new way of thinking about the global South. And it is about these South-South. So I think it's exactly, none of the chapters directly deal with it, but it's exactly what you're asking is the inspiration behind us putting together the book in the first place.
Can I just add something to that? I think, put in terribly simple terms, we're moving from a bilateral order to a multilateral order. But I think particularly people in South Africa are quite bad about thinking about multilateral orders because we live with an over-determination of bilateralism. The imperialism, colonialism, anti-apartheid, the Cold War. It's almost as though we can't think outside those kinds of epic categories. And we're moving into this kind of unpredictable and open multilateral world, as you said, with going to be all these different kind of focuses of power. And I think what's going to be interesting is the strangeness and bizarreness of that world. And if I could just use an example that I often use, and this was in the Cape Times today, that one of South Africa's most successful exports to India is the films of Jan Schuster. Now, if you had told me that 20 years ago that this was going to happen, it's unthinkable. And I think that's the really interesting area to watch, is to scan the cultural horizon for these really unexpected and bizarre things that are going to take shape. And I think the understanding the New World is through that will be important. Also, for example, we now in the Indian Ocean routinely have south-south spying. Okay? So it's again the discourse normally of the South was a very morally elevated shoulder-to-shoulder discourse. Now suddenly, how does one make sense of south-south slapstick and south-south spying?
Hi. My question is similar to that. Again, I haven't read the book, but as experts in South Africa, India relations, if you like, we've both thrown off our colonial masters, if you like, and yet India is growing at this huge rate, and South Africa is kind of plodding along. I'm kind of wondering, what happened? Why are these differences?
Well, we problematize some of that in the introduction as well. India is growing much faster than South Africa, but South Africa has a higher tertiary education rate. It has higher internet use rate. It has all sorts of other indicators that actually far outstrip India. And what we then say is actually they're complex societies. They're neither one is perfect, neither one is just entirely successful or entirely problematic. So I don't think you can simply explain either case in isolation of all these other contradictory processes and factors that are actually coming into it as well. I mean, even just if you look at inequality is greater here, poverty, the actual percentage of the bottom 20% of the population. In India, they get like 8.1% of the wealth, where here they get 3.something%. So that's worse. But yet, there's more people who don't have access to health care in India and don't have access to other things that we now consider part of the Human Development Index. So I think this is really complex.
There we go, this side now.
I'm just wondering, the great affinity between the Congress Party in India and the ANC, and looking at the similarities of where those two parties emerge from, does your book in any way touch on the seeming divergence in the present day, the ANC now suddenly turning towards China? The ANC suddenly turning towards China and not looking at the democratic experience in India. Do you at all touch upon that in your book?
Well, the simple answer is no. But it is interesting. There's one chapter on the book. It doesn't look at the ANC Congress Party. It looks at the SACP and the CPIM Communist Party and Indian Marxists. And looking at their ideological convergence in the 1990s. But they have very different practices in power, I would say. And it's very interesting because to look to China more than India, especially for the ANC, I think is influenced by the Communist Party, SACP's links to China. The South African Communist Party has had many delegations almost every single year that goes to China, and they have very, very firm relationships. So I think to look at the ANC relationship with China is very strongly influenced by the South African Communist Party. At the same time, it has some links to India, but they're not nearly as strongly rooted, I would say. But I think the histories are very interesting because the history of the ANC and SACP, people in the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of linkages with India, and people were visiting Naidu. A tremendous number of people actually went to India and were very influenced by the politics and things going on there as well. And that kind of legacy, I don't think, is continuing today.
Why has that happened?
Why has it happened? Why have they no longer looking to each other. Well, it's interesting. I would say that certainly I'm more familiar with the Communist Party than I am with the Congress Party in India and why they don't come strong. The Communist Party is a Marxist. I think has very strong feelings towards it, the South African Communist Party. I think they've been somewhat disappointed to see what's happened to the party in South Africa, but I think they would have very much wanted a stronger relationship, I think. But there's a complicated history of India and China, and if South Africa's gone that way, for the Communist Party, it's not going to compete, but it's